Welcome to The Ally Effect with Allyson Blythe, authentically living life your way. We all contemplate making changes in our lives that would allow us to live more authentically, but it can be hard to take action. Allyson is here to educate, equip, and empower you with the tools you need to start authentically living life your way. Get ready to eradicate your limitations and destructive patterns as you take full responsibility for your own happiness. This show is not just talk. It is conversation for profound self-awareness, acceptance, and appreciation, the key elements to stepping into the power as the creator of your very best life. The Ally Effect with Allyson Blythe starts now.
Hey everyone, and welcome. You're listening to The Ally Effect, authentically living life your way, with me, Allyson Blythe, certified life coach and licensed clinical social worker. Stay with me for the next hour as we dive deep into a different concept that will build on your idea of authenticity, how to help companion and support you in your walk in this journey. You can join me the first and third Thursday of every single month right here on Transformation Talk Radio, as we really have some rich conversation about authenticity. Today, we're going to follow up with our conversation about boundaries. Last time, we ventured into lots of different categories and some understanding of why boundaries are so challenging. It's a term that we've all heard about. You can't get too far in life without having some basic concept of the need for boundaries. Whether you're really strong and successful at them might be a whole other story. We kind of expanded on why is there so much confusion and why is it so hard to really understand, much less communicate, maintain, and follow through with your boundaries. We went over 4 different types. One of the reasons why boundaries are so challenging to understand is because there's so many different types that I didn't necessarily understand prior to doing this work and writing Misunderstood. So last time we talked about 4 different categories. We addressed physical boundaries, emotional, sexual, and verbal. I think these are kind of more of the commonplace boundaries where people have some understanding of those 4 different categories. Today, we're going to dive deeper into 8 other categories. But I'm wondering, if you have taken the time to listen to that episode, I'm wondering, what did you see? As we started to dive into those 4 different areas of boundaries and helping you recognize the importance of each of those categories, how much self-awareness did you have about any of those? Are you recognizing that maybe you're really strong in your physical boundaries, what space you need to maintain, but not necessarily quite as conscious or deliberate about your emotional boundaries? Yeah, I wonder for you, did you have any big wins, any levels of even just awareness, like recognizing maybe for the first time, I think this might be where I need a boundary, even if you weren't quite ready to set it or follow through with it? Any big wins in terms of awareness? What about actually asserting a boundary and clarifying your point of view, what works for you and what doesn't? I would absolutely love to hear any kind of success story or any struggle that you might be having during all of this process, because it can be quite a lot as you begin this work. Were you able to recognize any of your emotional cues, any indicators or kind of signs that, like, wait a minute, I'm starting to feel irritated or overwhelmed. I'm feeling resentful about this thing. How did you do with kind of making your boundaries and your feelings clear about things? Share with me. So where are we going to go today? We've got 8 more categories to dive into. Grab your pen and paper because I'm sure you might want to take notes. There's a lot of stuff that we're going to go through, the nuances of each of these different categories. What are we going to talk about today? Your financial boundaries and your material, the difference between your money versus your stuff, your things. We're going to talk about those precious commodities of time and energy and understanding how those will influence your levels of boundaries, your social boundaries, and one that I've kind of over the course of time developed into more what I would call connection boundaries. And then we're going to address food boundaries and spiritual. And we're going to dive right in because, as I said, we've got a lot to cover today in this episode. So we're going to talk about financial boundaries to start. Really, this is about your money management. And we addressed in that commodities episode previously that money holds a lot of energy. A lot of people have some kind of relationship or belief system about money. that can come out when in this category, understanding that there is an entire belief system or worldview. You probably have some of your own personal history and understanding of the use and value of money. Those are going to play into the way you feel comfortable with things like loaning money versus giving money. Now, you'll hear that I use two very separate words that oftentimes people don't necessarily recognize that there actually is a substantial difference. If you're ever in a situation to loan money, you have an expectation that you will get that back. Have you made those terms and conditions clear? Have you said, it's fine for you to pay me back $10 for the rest of your life, or I want $1,000 every other week? Like, what are your expectations if you're actually loaning the money? And have you made that clear? Are you more interested in just giving? You know what? I'm just going to give this money. I have no expectation, no ties. This is really for fun and for free, and I'm giving this money. Have you made that clear? These are very different expectations and probably come with two very different sets of conversations. It's important to understand and clarify ahead of time. What are the terms and conditions of borrowing versus loaning money? Okay, just important nuance there. What about paying for things for people? Why are you doing that? What's your motive for paying? Who are you paying for? How frequently? And how much are you willing to pay? Someone gets themselves in a pinch, maybe sickness has happened or job loss has happened, which is a very real dynamic in our world. And you are willing to contribute towards an electric bill every month because someone has kind of fallen on hard times. Does that really feel okay? Or this is someone who has back and forth struggled with keeping a job and showing up on time. And, are you willing to kind of contribute to a car payment or their mortgage that they can't afford? What are your terms and conditions for paying for something? It's a one-time birthday celebration. So of course you're going to buy the dinner, right? Like what are those dynamics? How do you relate with paying your bills or even things like your taxes on time? Are you pretty deliberate about managing your money, what goes in and what comes out every single month, and knowing deadlines and consequences of that? Are you okay with late fees? And it's really no big deal to have them add on $35 every month because you're running late with getting that payment in. Or are you someone who is very deliberate? The bill comes in and you're paying it immediately. These are those dynamics associated with how you feel about money and what boundaries feel okay. Are you okay with having debt and really incurring interest on that debt? Or is debt like not even tolerable or acceptable for you? Not right or wrong, not good or bad. It's just your personal preference. And I also wonder about your debt tolerance. Obviously, other people's money issues are really not your business. I have a grown daughter. She doesn't live in my house. She manages her own finances. And every once in a while I get a little curious, or I'm like, oh, I wonder how she's doing with X, Y, or Z. You know what? Not my business. She's not asking me for help. She's not asking me for input. So that kind of minding your own business when it comes to other people's, unless it's a conversation about loaning and giving, or even you borrowing money from other people. It's important to kind of consider, are you someone who really values the savings account? How much feels safe to you? Are you someone who hides money under the bed? And that's the investment you want to make. Every time you get some money, it goes under your bed in that little envelope or whatever. Or are you very deliberate about a retirement and a savings account where you're getting interest gained in that? Okay, these are your terms and conditions about money management of what feels okay and what doesn't. The next category is about your stuff. So one is about how you handle your money. The second one is about how you handle your stuff. Same components. How do you feel about loaning something to someone versus maybe giving your things away, your possessions? How have you made these terms and conditions clear that you're okay with someone borrowing a book for a month, or maybe not? Maybe like you want them back in a week. Have you made that clear? Someone borrows some tools or cooking utensils, clothing. What's okay with you and what isn't? Or are you giving things to people? Is that part of your love language, that you're a gift giver? What about your tolerance for clutter and messes? Are you someone who's perfectly okay with stacks and piles and different things on and around your possessions? Or are you kind of more along the lines of a neat freak and you want things in their specific places, in their specific order? Are you someone who's far more organized and you have a system for all of that? What about the idea, this has to do with material boundaries, what you'll buy and the reasons you're going to buy it? I come from a family, and I may or may not have this issue too, where we are coupon shoppers, right? So we get a 40% at a craft show, and you bet, we're like going to the craft store trying to spend our 40%. And my very wise young niece said, but you do know you're saving 100% if you don't even go, right? So what are the reasons you're buying things, and why are you doing that? Are you incentivized by things like coupons or sales, fear element of like, well, what if they run out? We went through a toilet paper crisis in our world, all these weird things of the reasons why you're buying things and investing in them. How do you feel about keeping things? Are you someone who has a grown child and you have every single art project that they ever had buried deep in the basement, baby clothes, things like that? Maybe someone has passed away and you have all of their items still stored in boxes because you just can't bear the thought of going through those or even donating those. Those are examples of material boundaries that feel important to you. The reasons you'll buy things, your borrowing behavior. Are you okay with a neighbor just simply walking in your garage and taking the rake and bringing it back when they're done with it? Or is that like crazy talk for you that it feels really uncomfortable? Someone walking into your closet and borrowing your shoes or your belt or something. What feels okay and what doesn't? So you can start to see already we've talked about two different categories and all of these different things. Maybe it might be okay with you if a neighbor borrows something, but not a sibling, or maybe vice versa. Like all of these different patterns and nuances that go on that are really important for you to start with your sense of self-awareness of what feels okay to you and what doesn't. And how can you begin to not only be aware of that, but also communicate it at the same time. Let's try to squeeze in one more before we go to break. We're going to talk about, in that commodities episode, we talked very significantly about these next two categories, your time management and your energy management. Time boundaries are absolutely critical for you to consider. We talked about it is by far the most precious commodity you can ever have. What are your preferences when it comes to time management? How you spend time? What are you doing? Who are you spending time with? Are you someone who absolutely wants to be early, right? That if you're not 20 minutes early, you're late. I tend to be someone who's right on time. I'm not going to be too early, and I'm definitely not going to be too late. The idea of being 2 minutes late is really anxiety producing. Or are you someone who does tend to run late? Are you 10 minutes late? Or are you the person who shows up sometimes 2 hours late? How do you handle lateness? How do you communicate it? How do you interpret it? What about time on the phone, ways that you're willing to communicate and engage with people, and time you're going to invest in that way? Spending time with certain people in certain places. You can probably imagine that changes the dynamic of how you feel and what feels okay to you. What about, are you someone who takes immediate action on something? Something happens and you're going to kind of invest right away in something. Or are you a procrastinator? Again, are you a 10-minute procrastinator, or are you like a 10-day, 10-month, 10-year procrastinator? How do you handle deadlines and what feels okay to you and what doesn't, in terms of, I know for me, a bill comes in, I sit down and I pay it that day. It doesn't matter when it's due. I set it up to I just want it taken care of. How are you doing with handling deadlines? All of those are examples of how you're handling your time boundaries and what's important. This is a critical one in terms of relationship dynamics too, and understanding that if you're partnered in any capacity with someone who has very different time management, maybe you're the early bird and they're the arrive late person, right? And how are you asserting communication and clarification with them in terms of what feels okay with you and what doesn't? So there you have it. There's the time boundary that we're going to add to that list. So when we come back, we're going to dive into even more. We're going to address some of those other boundaries. We're going to take a break right now. You're listening to The Ally Effect with me, Allyson Blythe. When we come back, we're going to take a quick break, but we are going to dive more into different categories of boundaries and helping you understand how they can help you authentically live life your way. We'll be right back. We're back here on The Ally Effect, authentically living life your way with me, Allyson Blythe, certified life coach and licensed clinical social worker. Before we go any further with this topic of boundaries, I've already really overloaded with you with tons of information about these different categories so far. I want to make sure you know how to be in touch with me. If you have questions or you need even more clarity after today, I want you to know that you can always reach out to me by calling 341-7773. You can be in touch with me that way. If you want to send me an email, which I check pretty consistently, like a lot of us do these days, it's AllysonBlythe@live.com. Maybe you're curious about some of the info that's on my site. Please feel free to visit that, which is AllysonBlythe.com. We are addressing boundaries today, understanding the different categories, the nuances that go in to understanding your own personal preferences and being able to communicate them and follow through with all of your boundaries. We've already addressed physical, emotional, sexual, verbal boundaries. We just went through financial and material boundaries, and we started talking about that time boundary. And again, I'm always curious about what is it that surfaces for you? What are you recognizing right out of the gate? Maybe areas where you're a little stronger and you know that you are okay in setting those types of boundaries. They feel perfectly comfortable to you versus some other ones that start to feel like, oh, I don't even know how to do that, or I have no idea what feels okay with me and what doesn't. This is your starting point to understand some of the different things that go into these boundaries and what's important for you to be able to consider. We talked about time. We had an entire episode that talked about commodities and helping you understand how you're spending your time, energy, and effort. We just finished up this conversation about your time boundaries and what feels comfortable to you and what doesn't. We're going to move into the next commodity. The next category is your energy. This is such an incredibly important one that's really a little bit more challenging to measure in some ways. If you have any confusion about your commodity of energy, go back and listen to that commodities episode to get a little bit more clarity. But we're going to talk today about your energy boundaries. And these have to do with your mental and emotional space that you allow people, places, and things to occupy in your life. What is the mental and emotional effort you're willing to engage? Or I always say, kind of, what are you willing to pay towards someone or something? Do you have people, places, or things living rent-free in your head? You've got a lot of thought and worry and planning, and just so much space is occupied by other people's stuff. Your energy boundaries have to do with like the emotional feel of something. How does something resonate with you? Do you get like this ick factor when someone comes into a room? Or is it, what about that committee that you're sitting on? You know that it's coming up on your calendar and you just feel the sense of dread and overwhelm. What about the company you keep? Are you just like absolutely excited about happy hour on Friday with coworkers? Or is it kind of this obligatory nasty thing that you just have to like do in order to get it done for the week? What is your energy, and how are you investing in these people, places, and things? What about that annual party that you host every single year that takes you 2 months to buy and prepare for, and also 2 months of therapy in order to process through, right? Like, what are you doing and why are you doing it? What's the energy associated with so much? Do you ruminate over things that are happening? Again, are you someone who really worries and get pretty obsessive and problem solving for other people, places, and things? Or is it the exact opposite? Do you have a lot of joy and excitement and gratitude about the people, places, and things? Chances are you don't need much of a boundary, or your boundaries are pretty in place if you do have this level of joy and excitement about the things that you're doing and the people that you're doing it with. How about in terms of energy? One more category is to understand, how much are you focusing on other people? Are you able to detach and let go of what they might be tangled up in, their problems or the consequences of some of their behavior? Or if someone else is struggling, does that mean you have to struggle too? This is an important one to consider. And I know this is a very significant boundary for me, energy. I can be around most people who have different levels of emotion, joy and excitement, deep despair and pain, anger, and even rage. Like, energy doesn't really bother me, but I have a tipping point. There's one avenue that I start, if people go down too far, I'm like, oh, it's deeply affected to me, or it affects me deeply. It's the dynamic of negativity, right? Like if someone really is just like a glass half empty type person, and it doesn't matter if it's sunshine and roses and everything good is happening in the world, they're gonna, yeah, but look at that one cloud, right? Like, negativity just has a certain energy to me that I cannot be around, because before I know it, I'm looking at the cloud. I'm affected by the negativity and I just don't like it. It has a contaminating energy to me. That would be an example of my energy. And I would say maybe, all right, I'll let them go for 30 seconds or maybe 3 minutes if it's a good day. And then I know it's like, all right, let's talk about something else. What can you tell me something good that happened today? Trying to redirect the conversation. Sounds like you're really struggling. Maybe we can try that again tomorrow, whatever it might be. That's an example of boundaries, that energy that feels important for you to be conscious of and how it affects you. Do you have energy vampires in your life? How willing are you to invest in other people's problems? As you talk about these issues, I wonder, can you tune into what your energy feels like to you right now, even as we speak about, as you can scan your body and kind of recognize like, yeah, I can kind of relate to that. Or energy really is about the way that you feel and the way that things impact you. All right. That's an energy boundary. The next one has to do with your social engagement. What are you doing? Who's going to be there? Where are you going? How long are you staying? Those are boundaries. And you can start to see the nuances that go along with this pattern. How would you identify yourself? Are you someone who is far more introverted, that you know that most of your energy comes from maybe more solitude and quiet and doing things that you really like to do? Or are you more outgoing and you're very extroverted and you want to engage and your fuel comes from doing things or going places and being with people? Not right or wrong, but also very different. Does your energy change? Here comes some of the energy boundary, not interfering, combining with a social boundary based on who you're with and what you're doing and how it feels. Do you have enough energy in order to engage? Does your energy change and your engagement with other people change based on who you're with? You become very extroverted when you're with your family and you know them and you love them and you're really engaged, but you're more with strangers and you become a little bit more introverted and reserved. Where's your energy in terms of your social engagement? Those are all examples. Are you a mix of both introversion and extroversion? What about the amount of time that you'll spend with people, places, and things and what you'll be doing? So some examples of this, we're kind of transitioned through the holidays and stuff. So what about hosting that annual work party and versus maybe hosting a Friendsgiving? Can you see that maybe one feels really exciting and really enthusiastic and you're happy to do it, and maybe another one has a very different feel? Same party, same planning, same process, but maybe some very different social engagement. To be at a work thing for 5 hours might feel really overwhelming and frustrating and depleting, but being at a Friendsgiving for you might actually feel really fun and exciting. You're okay to plan. That's a difference in these patterns of social engagement. What about going to loud places? If you gather with your college friends and you're doing homecoming, and there's a lot of crowd, and like, is that really something that feels exciting and enthusiastic to you? Or do you become completely drained and overwhelmed by that? You actually want more of a one-on-one type activity, so that you can hear about their job or their relationship or their family, their new neighborhood. Like what is important to you in terms of, do you want to do group settings with people? Do you want to do more one-on-one? Do you want to go to different activities and places? Those are all examples of social boundaries. If you're going out on a first date, do you want to go do an activity? Or do you want to sit maybe quietly with someone? If you're going to study with a friend and you know that you're going to do that, are you going to go to Starbucks and grab a cup of coffee and a table and you've got laptops and conversation? Or do you maybe want to join them at a library, right? Again, not right or wrong, just differences between people. This tends to be very, very fluid. The social engagement you have maybe on a Tuesday night might look very different than on a Sunday morning, right? So this changes often from day to day, person to person, and situation. Very rarely do people have the exact same social boundaries day in and day out, situation to situation. So those are examples of your social boundaries, yet another category. This next one is fascinating to me because as I was writing Misunderstood, I identified this as like what I called a distance boundary, meaning like space and distance in a relationship and even technology. What it's evolved to over the years is what I would now refer to as a connection boundary. What is your expectation about connection in a relationship? It's been fascinating to observe this. To me, this is a newer category of boundaries that I've seen evolve over the years. Things like social media, microwaves, like drive-through, instant gratification that we have, social media with likes and followers and thumbs up and hearts and all these different kinds of things that have changed the way we engage and socially interact with just connection in relationship. I'm going to give you some examples because I think that these are the most helpful ways to drive home the point of how these can be so different with people. I have in one of my coaching groups, I have two clients who are both hairstylists, and they will often have conversation. And one has been very irate with her clients that they're texting her at 10:30 at night, 12:30 at night, and she has her phone on, right? And so she's getting these messages thinking that they have this expectation that they're going to contact her, or that she's going to contact them right away. The other one has a very different system. She tells her clients to email, and they can email at any point because she's not notified by those except the little number on her phone. And then she'll respond to that email when she gets it and she's doing her client stuff. But two very different expectations, two different interpretations about client contact. I'm also in a group chat. How many of you are in group chats these days, right? It's like, oh, group chat. Before you know it, you've got like 17 new messages coming up. I have two friends who are in different time zones. And I'm an early morning texter, right? And so I was sending off text messages. And one of the ladies came and said, hey, listen, I'm 3 hours behind and I'm getting some of these text messages at like 4 a.m. I keep my phone on all night. Please, let's not do it that way. Can we wait until X time? The other one said, I keep my phone off all night long. I don't really care. But the nuances of communication and connection, these are really important to understand. Are you someone who's a thumbs up relationship status on social media? Are those things really important? Do you want to spend quality time with someone or quantity time? You don't necessarily care what you're doing. You can sit and scroll, maybe you'll get a little squeeze of the knee, something, and that feels really connecting. Or would you rather maybe have a shorter period of time where you're one-on-one and you're in conversation? Do you want to connect daily? Or is it okay for you to maybe connect once a week? We all have that friend who it's totally fine. We don't need to see them for a year at a time, 5 years at a time. And that level of connection still allows us to still very much love each other, but we don't need to do that. Do you want to text? Do you want to call? Do you want to FaceTime? Do you want in person? These are all examples of connection boundaries that will completely matter in your relationship with other people. How aware are you? And how are you doing with clarifying other people's boundaries of what works and what doesn't work? So yet one more category that we can add to the list. We are going to take a really quick break, and you're listening to The Ally Effect, Authentically Living Life Your Way. When we come back, we're going to address even more categories and talk a little bit more about the details of these boundaries. Here we are back on The Ally Effect, Authentically Living Life Your Way, with me, Allyson Blythe, certified life coach and licensed clinical social worker. Having deep conversation, educating, equipping, and empowering you in this idea of authenticity. Today, we're addressing boundaries. We did this in the last episode, and now today, carrying the conversation to help you understand all of the different categories, why people get maybe so confused and overwhelmed about how to set boundaries, how to clarify what feels okay and what doesn't. So far, we've addressed 10 different categories of boundaries. And we're going to wrap up with ending with the next two categories. We're going to address food boundaries. And this is one that not a lot of people, they're like, food boundaries, but it's pretty significant. Either what I have found is that people either really have this issue or it's not really much of an issue. Like it's not really that big of a deal. I am very Italian. I grew up that way. I have very fond memories, and cooking, eating, preparing, shopping for Man, that is a love language through and through. It's very significant to me to share meals, to share prep, to cook together. It's a very connecting, intimate experience that I do with people that I really care about, friends and family. It just matters to me. But I often find that people don't have those same types of boundaries. The idea, stopping through a drive-through or waiting 20 minutes for a waitress to come take your order, or like some people want to share food and connect through food. Other people don't touch my food, like don't even think about coming near me with a fork. Kind of understanding, like we all have these different preferences. Some feel very, very strongly. For me, food is very nurturing and very connecting, but it doesn't mean that that's that way for everybody else. How do you feel about things like sharing food, cooking food? Do you have specific preferences about food that you will eat or food that you absolutely won't eat, won't even try? What about, this is very interesting, eating after someone? What about sharing like literally a meal? I have a girlfriend who all the time we go out and we just order one thing and we just continue to nibble off that. And that feels fine to each of us. Again, other people, absolutely not. Taking food off of other people's plates, right? Like it's a real thing for someone. Someone might absolutely not care. Other people want to whack you with their fork, right? What about leftovers? There's a big, people have very different feelings about leftovers. If there is ever any issue, sometimes people will have like germ stuff associated with that, or maybe even food scarcity, that it can be a very huge issue for people and can trigger very significant issues with them. What are your food boundaries? What feels okay in terms of preparing, shopping, cooking, actually sitting down? I know many people, and I've been guilty of this, you just sit at the counter and eat because you're in a hurry, versus maybe really sitting down and enjoying a dinner. Do you want to do that 2 times a week, every single meal, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, 7 days a week? What are your preferences when it comes like that to those types of things? And how have you done at clarifying and communicating those things? So here we are, number 12, your spiritual boundaries, and understanding that no matter what your spiritual beliefs are, whether it's, it doesn't matter what your spiritual beliefs are. And how clear are you about what your personal spiritual relationship is? What are your belief systems? It doesn't have to be right or wrong, good or bad, but what is it that you believe that feels really important to you? Do you have a spiritual practice? Does your spiritual practice look like 10 a.m. church service every Sunday? Does it look like hitting a yoga mat 4 or 5, 7 days a week? Does it look like sitting underneath a tree and feeling your presence on the earth? Does it look like some type of prayer and worship for you? What is your spiritual practice? What feels comfortable and what doesn't? How about your morals, your ethics? The things that you really value and prioritize, things that feel right to you and things that really don't feel right to you. Are there certain words, phrases, or terms that really matter to you? They kind of, some things that feel really comfortable to you. There's a family member that I have, the saying, "Oh my God," is really offensive to her. And where other people see it as very prayerful and meditative, like calling upon, whatever it might be. And so the different interpretations and expectations you have about your own spiritual beliefs, your spiritual practices, things that feel comfortable and right and good or valuable to you, those are all examples of your spiritual beliefs. So there we have it. We have covered all 12 categories. We've talked about your physical, emotional, your sexual boundaries, your verbal, the financial ones, the material ones, your time and your energy, your social boundaries, your food boundaries, and now your spiritual boundaries. As you can probably see, none of the categories that we've talked about, none of these nuances and the specific details of each piece are right or wrong. Your preferences are just that. They're yours. It doesn't necessarily make you wrong and another person right, or certainly vice versa. Unless we're talking about a safety issue, I mean, like really someone doing harm or maybe committing a crime, boundaries are simply your clarifying points of what you like and what feels good to you. All right. So just important to kind of have this understanding that unless we're talking about a harmful or an illegal type behavior, it's just important for you to know what your tipping point is of how long or what feels okay and what doesn't. Boundaries are absolutely your right and your responsibility to handle, to be clear about, to communicate with other people, to follow through, to manage your side of the street, so to speak. Boundaries will also single-handedly shape the quality of your life and the health of your relationships. Boundaries, to me, when we're talking about authenticity, they seem to companion very, very strongly. Really, the more boundaried you are, the more authentic you will be able to be, because you are in charge of your own experience and your own relationships. So I will encourage you, take a breath. Like, that is a lot of information. I know that it's a lot to take in. And I'm wondering, what is it that you're recognizing? Just even starting to approach the idea of 12 different categories of boundaries. How does that feel to you? Probably just like anything else that's brand new to you. In the beginning, this is really overwhelming for some people. You feel pretty uncertain about what this means or where you can begin. How is this actually going to look and play out? We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about this. You might not have a clue about where to begin in any of it. I'm hoping to give you some starting points with that today. In the very beginning, the two most critical components of boundaries is going to be awareness and clarification. So you becoming aware of you, not other people. We talked about the energy boundary of all your energy going out to other people. But we're going to talk about what is happening inside of you. Awareness is absolutely one of the most powerful tools that you can begin with. Clarification might take a little bit of time and a little bit of tweaking and practice, but your awareness, you can tune in. Remember, we talked about paying attention to how something feels to you, no matter who's involved. But it's my mother, but it's my children. What's going to happen? No matter how long you've done something, it's important to begin to tune inward to start to recognize how things feel to you. This is your life, and your feelings are actually trying to tell you something. It's important to listen to what they're trying to inform you of. Pay attention to how you feel and maybe dig a little deeper at that. I believe there are maybe two approaches. There's probably a ton of approaches to setting boundaries. I want you to think maybe two different avenues and what one feels more right to you. It feels, the example that came to my head is, are you going to take like the slow and steady pace, kind of like the slow and steady wins the race? Or are you going to take more like the biggest loser approach? Are you just going to dive in and try to figure out this thing called boundaries? Change can happen in all kinds of ways, but I want to give you some clarity about the two avenues and allow you to really decide what works for you, what authentically feels right in terms of how you want to set and start to establish some of these boundaries. The first avenue is to allow you to start very, very small. The example of this is maybe you start with the 2-pound weights, right? You're just starting to practice with something to feel how comfortable it is, how well and stabilized can you be with just this little tiny added weight. You're still moving along really well, making healthy decisions, but it's not too overwhelming for you. So an example of how to start small. We've all had those experiences, like we're out shopping somewhere and a salesperson's like, oh, excuse me, come in. And maybe your example of this starting small would be, not today, thank you very much. And you just keep walking, right? Would you typically succumb to that and let yourself be drawn into that conversation or signing on the dotted line? Or maybe you start with someone who's very safe. This person is not going anywhere. And so you can practice setting a boundary with them. Maybe they are the people who call you and say, hey, do you want to get dinner tomorrow night? Do you want to do Mexican or sushi? And your tendency is always to defer to them, right? You don't necessarily ever declare your opinion or your preference. But this time you decide to do it a little differently. Maybe you take the stand, you pick up that 2-pound weight and you say, I'm in for Mexican tomorrow night. Let's decide on that. 6 o'clock works for me, right? Like, it's so teeny tiny. And if you're really strong at setting boundaries, you might roll your eyes. But if you've really struggled with boundaries, even that can feel a little bit unstable. Maybe you set a time limit. Someone is saying to you, the event is from 4 to 8, and 4 to 8 feels, you got the social boundary and you've got this time and energy boundary, and you're like, ugh, 4 to 8. And so you go within and you're like, you know what? I am happy to be there by 4, and I'm going to be leaving by 5:30. Thanks for the invite. Not a big deal, right? But you're very clear about what helps you feel more comfortable in that. Someone calls the night before an event and says, I need 3 dozen cookies. Can you help me out? And instantly you're overwhelmed and frustrated, irritated by that. And you say instead, you know what? I'd be happy to make one. I'll have them there for you by 4 p.m. Like you start to dictate what feels okay, and you work on very small ways of making a boundary or a task much more manageable. The second avenue has way more to do with just ripping the Band-Aid off. Maybe it is absolutely time. It's time for you to go walk through the loneliness of a breakup, the heartache of that. You know that it's time to end a relationship. Maybe you're ready to put in your notice. You don't know what the heck you're going to do for your next job, but you just know you've got to rip that off, and you establish the boundary. You put in your notice, you pack your bags and move out of a place. Or maybe it's the exact opposite. Maybe you sign up for the team. One year I committed to taking swimming lessons to improve my skills. Scared the bejeepers out of me, right? But I just did it. I committed and I signed on the dotted line in order to hold myself accountable, in order to do something that was in my best interest. Set maybe one specific boundary, and you're just going to stand in that and practice with that boundary the best that you can. You're going to be very clear. You're going to shape up your words really strongly about what you want to do, what feels okay and what doesn't. Maybe you actually start to say something like, I resign from this committee as of 1/1, right? Like that's the boundary. And you're really firm in your words. Get some support, talk to people, talk it out so that they can kind of support you and hold you accountable for maybe that one big ripping the Band-Aid off. You decide which approach is right for you. Only you can decide. And your willingness and readiness are really two important things to consider: readiness and willingness to actually follow through. It only becomes a threat if you're not willing to follow through with your boundaries. So we're going to take one more break. When we come back, we're going to continue this conversation, authentically living life your way. And we're going to talk one more piece about boundaries. We'll be right back. All right, here we are back on the Ally Effect, authentically living life your way. I am here really just having this conversation about this thing called boundaries and helping you understand what works for you and what doesn't. We wrapped up the last segment talking about, where do you even begin? Are you someone who's just ready to start to practice teeny tiny little steps, or are you ready to dive in head first and you're just going to figure it out along the way? We've talked about why boundaries can be so overwhelming and confusing at times. And one of the most critical steps I want to leave you with is this reality that what I said at the very end of this last segment: if you are not ready to set a boundary, just don't. That's totally okay. Maybe you keep working up, practicing the conversations before you actually try to communicate something. But otherwise, it just becomes an empty threat, and it will discredit you, make you more wobbly, and feel like boundaries don't work, right? Boundaries absolutely do work when we set them appropriately and effectively. We've talked about the different categories. I'm going to go through them one more time. You've heard them a lot, but I think it's important to begin to understand all of the different categories. We talked about physical, emotional, sexual, and verbal boundaries, your money, your stuff, financial and material, your time and your energy. We've addressed social boundaries and your connection boundaries, and also food and spiritual. Just the number alone is a lot to take in for people. So it's okay that automatically, if you're feeling like, oh, if you're not very well versed in boundaries, or you struggle with any concept of self-awareness, maybe you have been someone who's so tuned in to what's okay for other people and what they need. This might be a lot for you to start to even know how to recognize what's happening inside of you. We've talked a lot about a lot of different variables and all of these different pieces and parts to what feels okay, and how sometimes doing certain things with certain people feels different ways, certain times of the day, certain times of the year or the week. Like there's so many different pieces and parts for you to know at any moment, like, I'm okay with that, I'm not okay with that. Why did this suddenly change? And for you to pay attention, and knowing that your feelings are indicators and cues that really just need to be tuned into, like, what's going on here? Why is this not okay with me? Or what's happening? if it's really no wonder that you might be feeling some type of confusion and why it might seem kind of impossible for you to start. I assure you, it is absolutely not impossible at all. It's very possible for you to start to recognize and build up your ability to recognize boundaries, to begin to speak them, become aware of them, follow through. But I also will say, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert. Happily ever after does not exist. This is really somewhat of a BS script that we fall susceptible to, kind of this idea that we're just going to get to this place with boundaries, or that we're going to find that one person who just magically knows and does the right thing and knows how to read us. And that's not real life. Boundaries, oftentimes it's hard enough for me and for you to kind of understand what's okay and what's not okay. It is impossible for anyone on the outside to know, to love you enough, to be around you enough, to care about you enough, to magically be able to just simply read your boundaries. It's absolutely critical for you to not only become aware, but to take responsibility. We've romanticized and idealized the way that people should just simply know what's okay with us and what isn't. There is absolutely no way for them to magically be able to read your mind. So be mindful of your expectations of other people, because it's not okay to just assume that they will know. Most of us believe that other people have the exact same boundaries that we have. And they don't. We talked about that connection category and realizing that people have very different expectations about what feels okay. If you're not clarifying and communicating those in any way, that might be your starting point. Do you have any unrealistic expectations for people when you might struggle yourself to really know what works and what doesn't? How can anybody else possibly know? So a question was asked, and I always appreciate these different perspectives. This person said, I am scared to death to disappoint people that I love, but I also know it's time to do things differently. I've begun to recognize these feelings of fed upness that we've talked about when we start to recognize like this irritation and frustration, disappointment and depletion, like these signs and symptoms of this pseudo diagnosis that I call fed upness. How can I take care of myself and also prepare for these changes? Yeah, it's like suiting up and getting ready to start a journey, like it's like I got to suit up and take on this mission. And so I want you to take a breath and just kind of know the boundaries are not a pass fail. It's not an all or none. And it's not like you get one chance to ever set the right boundary. It is a practice. That's why I say like happily ever after doesn't really exist. It's like health. You don't go to the gym one time, you don't go to the gym for a year and you never have to do anything. Boundaries continue to need to be practiced and worked out and clarified and all these different kinds of things. And as you travel down this road of authenticity, I will really encourage you to use that toolbox that I talk about in SOS, that sense of self toolbox, in helping you really build and strengthen all of these tools, your sense of self. So what are some of those tools? We'll go through. I want to offer, I've already talked a lot about self-awareness. That is one of the tools. Self-awareness puts you in the driver's seat. It helps you kind of, as you're going along, it helps you kind of know like, ooh, bump in the road. Oh, what's happening? What's going on up there? It helps you tune in and really be conscious of what's working and why things are shifting. And it allows you to really be your own best advocate in things. It allows you to be much more fully equipped to handle those people, places, and things really to the best of your ability. Another SOS tool that I thought was really important was self-permission, like really writing yourself the permission ticket to do things differently. I know you might be X number of years old and maybe you've always done things this way, or you don't really know where to begin. But I want to really encourage you to offer yourself permission to do what feels right, to begin to say no and to start to take responsibility for the satisfaction that you have and the health of your relationships. Another tool is called self-honoring. And once we become aware, it can be really challenging. It's like, okay, so now what? Self-honoring is your ability to align your behavior, right? Like you're going to be, if you think about anything that you honor, that you're more protective and you hold it in high value. What behaviors, what conversations, what tasks do you need to do in order to really honor what feels okay and what doesn't? So that's another tool: self-awareness, self-permission, and also self-honesty. Another tool, and I love this one. This one often I encourage people to do pen to paper. That might be helpful. Like, what boundaries do you want to begin to set? What areas do I need some work on? But the next tool is called self-defining. You get to decide for yourself what works and what doesn't. I know, your culture might have done it this way. Your family did it that way. In your place of employment, they've always done it this way. What about for you? What works for you? And how can you begin to define what feels okay and what doesn't? Self-defining gives you this clarity and perspective about concepts like happiness or success, that you know that you're aligning yourself much more with the things that work for you. And then the last tool that really some people are like, this is a harder tool. It's self-responsibility. Remember, we said that there's no knight in shining armor. There's no fairy tale that where things happen and it's all magic. Self-responsibility is knowing that you're in charge of your life. And it really is up to you in order to make these things be different. We would love if people would just know what works for us and what doesn't, and they would just fall into line and behave themselves and just do what they need to do, right? But that isn't really how the world works. We just said that most people have very different sets of boundaries and what works for them and what doesn't work for them. Your responsibility comes in being able to have that conversation, align yourself with the behavior. Maybe you end something or begin something, and being able to hold that space of self-protection, self-honoring, self-respect, as you really take responsibility for what works in your life and what doesn't. So where do you begin? There's some tools for you to be able to practice this idea of boundaries and authentically living life your way. Remember, you teach people how to treat you. If you are allowing certain behaviors, you've got some information now and some tools and some resources for you to begin to do things differently. If you are not liking the results you're getting with some of this, maybe that's the attention that you need. You need to set some boundaries, and some stuff is going on that really needs your attention. So you know how to find me, Allyson Blythe at live.com, AllysonBlythe.com, and 859-341-7773. You can join me the first and third Thursday right here on Transformation Talk Radio. You could also send me any kind of information, any successes, any struggles. I would love to hear those. Social media, I'm at Allyson Blythe Life Coach. I want to thank you for tuning in. This stuff really matters. And it's the idea that as we all begin to walk authentically, living life your way, how can we support each other and really acknowledge this work that we're trying to do? I absolutely had a wonderful time, and I'll see you next time as we continue authentically living life your way.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ally Effect with Allyson Blythe. The moment you decide to take control of your own well-being, you start the journey of authenticity. Tune in next time for more empowering conversations and practical tools to help you shed your fear, worry, comparison, and less than beliefs. Stick with us as you step into the driver's seat and head off onto the road of success and happiness. Your best life awaits.